So let me start with you, Pascal. We have met 3 times in recent months, at the Polar Summit in Paris, at the COP28 in Dubai, and in Paris recently following the Monaco Polar Symposium. Of course, as many of you know, Pascal Lamy has a long-standing experience of dealing with some of the most difficult challenges in the world. So how do you think we should go forward in enhancing polar cooperation and dialogue?
Well, thanks first for the invitation.
And also, if I may add, why was France so engaged in this? Yes.
Well, France took this initiative last year because the president of France is surrounded by a few fans of the hydrosphere. He's one of the first French presidents, and I'm not doing any politics here. He's one of the first French presidents who understands how important the hydrosphere is in general for the environment, for the economy, for strategic security. And he has been developing a French strategy, including in recruiting a quite formidable guy which Antje and I know well, and which you know well now, the French ambassador for Poles and Oceans, Olivier Prévost-Darvor, who's both a diplomat, an artist, and a guy with many talents. So, having a first polar summit was one of the stages of the development of this French and European strategy. And this is where I come in, more with my European hat than with my French hat, and also with my hat of co-chair of a major, I believe, international coalition which is called Antarctica 2030, the purpose of which is to try and surround Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, with marine protected areas. There's an obvious case that overfishing of krill in this region is a huge environmental problem because it basically is very much the source of the whole ocean food chain elsewhere. So a few of us have been working on that. I was the chair of the Paris Peace Forum. I'm now the vice chair, which hosted officially this summit last year. And we've devised a model, which we've discussed together, which is organizing a dialogue, which is why this polar dialogue really, in my view, makes sense, between the various stakeholders. Governments, of course, but also civil society, business, local populations who have a lot to say, and this was pretty obvious last year in Paris, and of course, science. And this is where I'm extremely grateful that the Arctic Circle accepted to take the baton to move forward this effort in mostly 2 directions. One is science. We do not know 2/3 of what we should know to properly address what threaten the cryosphere, the poles, and the ice elsewhere. That's the same for the ocean, by the way. So we need a huge effort, a huge investment, including, and I'm working a lot on that with my hat of the chair of the European mission Starfish, which is about regenerating the EU hydrosphere by 2030, including in using AI. The digital twin of the ocean can be a digital twin for the poles and for the cryosphere and help us understanding much better and much more quickly what we don't understand to act. And then, of course, action. Science is a major issue, and I'm glad Antje is here because she's one of the, maybe the popes of hydrosphere science on this planet. She has an incredible capacity to share what she knows and to convince that we should know more. And of course, as you said, moving things, if possible, into action. And I think that's where we have a lot of hope, that the new edition in a less formal, less state-driven, I mean, that's France, you can't change your country, in a less formal, less diplomatic, but in a way more interactive model is the one you are projecting. And I must say, I'm personally, and as one of the initiators of last year's first Polar Summit, extremely grateful to you and to the Arctic Circle for that.
Well, if we move to the science side, I mean, you were one of the co-chairs of the science report to the Polar Summit in Paris.
Yeah, and there sits the other one, Jérôme Chapelas.
I know, yes. And also, with all due respect to other scientists, your leadership on organizing expeditions into the Arctic as well as Antarctica and leading the Alfred Wegener Institute gives you a unique position in this. Can you share with us how you see the challenges and what would be the constructive way of moving forward in this?
For science, of course, challenges exist on various levels. The one deep one is, of course, understanding what the Earth system and the climate system and the hydrosphere has in stock for us. So, as you have heard also this morning, the sudden retreat and loss of sea ice in Antarctica, the extreme jump in the heat content and the warmth of the surface ocean, the rapid decline of various biosphere components, but also some nice messages, the return of populations of the largest whales. Many of these things are for us yet not possible to foresee and to model appropriately. And to have a way that science collaborates to minimize the risk that society has with the decisions society takes is, of course, deep into the core of scientific action. And so we see the cryosphere, the hydrosphere, as the key part of the Earth system that we need to understand. It's where changes occur the fastest and where we really need to understand what it means. A recent study has, and we have had that in the other panel, a recent study has found out, whereas most countries have the idea that they cannot afford to do the best for climate protection and biosphere protection because it costs them socioeconomical development chances, new economic model shows it's quite the opposite. If we continue on our path that we are, we will damage the socio-economical development of most countries on Earth. And so to understand this and to have an offer to society that we minimize errors in our risk assessment across the table, not only with natural sciences, but much beyond, to the behavior of humans, which are the worst predictable animal on Earth, that is our task, and that's what we want to contribute.
Mm-hmm. You think it is possible to create a comprehensive global scientific cooperation on the poles?
Well, it is still there. So in a way, we could probably say, because of our history as humans, it is not so that all countries, all people have a fair access to the making of science. And even though we see dramatic things in our data, I can tell you that being a scientist, making discoveries, finding solutions, is a fantastic feeling. And if we would already be in a fair world, everyone who has that wish to participate with seeing the future, breaking the walls of not knowing, should be welcome. So if you have no polar infrastructure, or if in a country open science and free and democratic science is not wished for, of course that's unfair and it makes it problematic to collaborate. But we have a position right now in polar and ocean sciences because they have a tradition in being international and cooperative to really have one culture of working together, and that includes so far practically all countries.
Frederik, you have been involved in this for a long time and tried to make a significant contribution in planning expeditions to Antarctica, into the Arctic. You also have worked with Bhutan for a long time and share the vision of the Himalayan and the third pole significance in this. Having also been an active part in running the Arctic Circle, as well as being at the Polar Summit in Paris, at the symposium in Monaco in recent times. What are the lessons and the recommendations you could share with us here as we try to move forward?
Well, over the years, I think I've been on about 4 or 5 panels with Antje, and we have always disagreed, so we should continue with that. Antje is, like most of the researchers here, advocating that we will continue to do research in the polar regions like we've done in the last 2 generations. That is, trying to measure the changes. Billions have been spent by states, government agencies to measure the changes. I think we're well behind that point. What we need to do now is just to go one step ahead, not just mitigating the changes, but also putting research into how to revert the changes. As you know, Greenland, when it melts, the ice there will lead to the water levels on the Earth going up, the sea levels going up 7 meters. And of course, this is the Arctic Circle, but I hope you allow me to talk about Antarctica. Yeah. If Antarctica melts, it will be 10 times more. We have to do something. We don't have much time. We already see the solutions on the horizons. We know that there are things we can do, which will be very, very political, and we will put many, many of our current people in various ministries into a great conundrum, because are they going on one side? They're going to be attacked by what they call the Greens here in Germany for doing geoengineering. On the other side, you have people who want this to happen very, very quickly. I usually say that when we have 3 meters of waters in the streets of New York and Manhattan, people will ask, hey, you politicians, you gave these tens of billions to all these researchers over 60 years. What happened? What is the result? So when we learn how the ice changes in different degrees, we know how the trees grow faster and lower. We know how the moss change, but that's not what we want. We need to put the money into where we can do the changes.
Well, I can tell you all, it is fantastic to disagree with Frederik. It is a productive and creative process, and I would have to answer at this point. Scientists are there to advise, and the good thing is we will have a track record. If there's so much water in New York and they turn to the scientists and will say, well, thank you, you have all alerted us, but it was not enough, and they will turn around to economy and governments and ask, why did you not follow the scientists? That will be the most likely scenario we have to expect. No, but I honestly, it is all belonging together. So I was just in Svalbard with our research ministry, she had mentioned that. We've had a discussion from our observatory there where so many individuals, institutions from different countries observe the atmosphere and try to understand what it means when ice melts and we have warming of the ocean and the cloud cover changes and the aerosol concentration change and black particles also play a role. So what they do, and then we have ice research that looks at the volcanic ashes and what they have done to temperature. So while we are understanding Earth, we are providing that knowledge that you need to alert, again, decision makers when the first people start wanting to throw sulfur particles into the atmosphere. And I agree with Frederik that this is just a few minutes away, that there will be an active intervention with the climate. Some call it climate fixing. It is already there, it has started. And so where are we? What procedures do we have to say the atmosphere needs protection as everything else, and we have to find a way to internationally agree on solutions? What are they? Who has to pay for them? Who is the risk assessing part? And so there, I think it's very important to discuss this. It's not an easy process, but it has to happen.
Before we,
good, Frederik?
Yeah, okay. Before we continue this dialogue here,
the two of us. Yeah.
Pascal, Lamy, and I served on a commission 7, 8 years ago, organized by IRENA, the new international agency for renewable energy. And it was supposed, and it did in fact, deal with the geopolitical changes of the renewable energy transition. And it was a collection of pretty clever people from different parts of the world. But as we started out our dialogue, I think most of us thought this was perhaps far into the future. The conclusion we came to, as we outlined in the report, is that this renewable transition was already happening. And I think since the report was published, now it has become a general wisdom that not only is it happening, it must happen, and it must happen at a quicker pace. So in your experience also as a head of the World Trade Organization and so on, you think it is economically and politically feasible to bring the polar science into the core decision-making on the energy transition, on the economic decision?
I think the answer is yes. Before explaining why, I of course fully remember the time we spent together trying to assess the geopolitical consequences of the shift to renewables, which overall we thought would be very positive. I stick to this conclusion, and what has happened for the last 4 years, including the Russian aggression in Ukraine, is a proof that it is right. We would not have the sort of wars which we have today on this planet if the energy systems were as decentralized as they are with renewables, which they are not with fossils. So I don't want to turn this conversation into a big philosophical discussion, but I firmly believe that remaining addicted to fossils is in a way remaining addicted to conflict. Now, on your question, I was a Navy officer when I was young, in the Middle Ages. And what I've seen, and I've been involved in these issues in my various professional activities, including at the WTO with this negotiation on subsidies to fish. One of the big problems we have in bringing the hydrosphere into the radar of climate biodiversity conversation is that it's so bloody far away. And we did studies in the Starfish mission in the European Union trying to assess where was the problem. Part of the problem is that people don't like the ocean. It's far away, it's unknown, maybe probably dangerous. So we need to compensate this sort of negative emotional energy with more positive emotional energy. Now, of course, whales, dolphins, birds whose stomach is open with plenty of plastics, that's good. It creates a real emotional directive. But what I have seen and what I have tested with various publics is that the ice, the pole, the Arctic as a big frozen sea, the Antarctic as a continent with 2/3 on the ice of this planet, when you see the images of these ice mountains falling into the water, when you start a discussion on this, it has an impact on public perception. And I think this is very important because this emotional dimension is, in a way, what really drives people's opinions to action today. I deeply regret that we are now in a world where there's no difference between truth and fake news. People are, on the rational side, they are lost. We have to compensate this with a very strong emotional approach, and I believe this is what also we should do in the next edition of the Polar Summit or Dialogue.
Frederik, you want to make a comment on what they said?
Well, we talked earlier about the research in general, if you allow me to come back to that, and I think it's very difficult to start talking about projects in the Arctic when half of the Arctic is not involved. So I find it very strange that we have not been able to find a mechanism to work with that other half, since in Antarctica there is a mechanism in place. We seem to be able to work with that country in one of the poles, but not in the other. Again, how can we, if we want to do serious research which involves all of the Arctic, exclude half? I mean, it's just not possible. We have to find a way of addressing that issue.
No, I agree. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we are organizing this session on science diplomacy here. But before I comment on that, let me ask you a question, because you said we already know enough before. Many people are saying, in response to what you said about Russia, but supporting your view about Russia.
I didn't mention Russia.
No, I know you didn't, but I mean, everybody knows half of the Arctic is within Russia. It's a euphemism for talking about Russia. People say we will not be able to conduct climate science without access to the Russian Arctic data, especially with respect to the melting of the tundra in the Russian Arctic. Do you think we already know enough about the Russian Arctic from a scientific point of view?
The question is wrongly put. It's not a question if we know enough. It's a question that we have limited in resources to put into the research.
Yeah.
And how should we put in those resources? I repeat what I said before. Are we going to keep going on with the same measurement-oriented research, or are we going to shift that over to research which is going to find solutions? If we are working on solutions, clearly we cannot work on solutions which cover only half of the Arctic. That it has to include all of it, and that's why it's important to get this neighbor involved.
No, but to illustrate your point a little bit more, and put this first to you, Pascal.
I would like, I'm sensitive about the language, right? So there is a moment of self-exclusion. It would be unfair to say that it's the rest that excludes Russia. There is a mechanism in which Russian scientists are threatened for their lives if they would speak out the truth. And that thing must be clear. It is not only about sanctions. One can debate those, of course, as usually. But if you have a government that does not support free speech, that tortures people for free speech, it is not possible for most of other countries with free science to cooperate. It's just like it is. And I would like that this is clear, and that we are not greenwashing conflicts here, that they are at that dimension. We know of scientists who had to leave the country, we know of scientists that had to choose another job, and that's not just because of the sanctions.
I understand your argument. But it's difficult to implement in practice. Many people argue alarmingly that there are a number of universities in America where free speech is being threatened in a fundamental way. There are people who say you can't even have a normal scientific discussion anymore, and lecturers and others are being excluded from the campus. And whether we like it or not, more than half of humankind does not live in what we would call free speech society. It doesn't mean we exclude half of humankind for this dialogue. I often remind my European friends that in the first few years of my life, there was only one democracy on the European continent. And it's debatable whether it was a democracy. That is Switzerland, and it didn't allow the women to vote at that time. The entire European continent was under either fascist, Nazi, or communist dictatorships.
Yeah, and it has thrown science backwards.
I know. So democracy and free speech as a general European phenomena is, as the Chinese say, 50 years is not a long time, a pretty recent phenomenon. But as I look at it, we have a situation where India, China, also other Asian countries are active in polar science and cooperation, irrespective of any political issue. In the Arctic, we have the very interesting phenomena, which is not often discussed, of this remarkable treaty which was signed about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, the Central Arctic Ocean Treaty, which is supposed to have scientific research as the core basis of possible future fisheries in the Arctic Ocean. And this was signed by European Union, America, Russia, China, my own country, a number of others. And despite the geopolitical situation and the war, Korea has conducted COP meetings on the basis of this treaty, where all the membership countries of this treaty, including Russia, have actually participated. And then we have the Arctic Council, which is in this shape which we discussed in the previous session. So there is no single pattern of how polar science is being conducted in this way, or even politically organized. And
but the spirit for collaboration is still so strong. I could give you some examples. We just had various meetings around Arctic about large missions that are planned where every country who can wants to help. The question of coastal erosion is one of them. Canada is organizing one of the biggest expeditions to understand how the Canadian rivers bring chemicals to the Arctic Ocean, what the coastal erosion means, how fast it goes, how the darkening of the ocean winds and draws in other countries, and this possibility to use every bit of science infrastructure and scientists sustainable and build the next generation of scientists is stronger than ever, I would say. And we should be proud that there are these hubs, these meetings where it is possible that we plan and organize together.
So you think your advice to a young scientist who wants to devote his or her career to polar science is that it will be a truly open global field?
It is. So, of course, as we started out with, and you said correctly, not all countries are included simply because they have maybe no science or no access for women or no polar research icebreaker or whatever. But the way that science is able to build an open space for those who want to participate has fundamentally changed. I'll give you just one example. It was mentioned here also during the conference here and there. The EU project Polarine, where so many countries assembled to say, let's look into our infrastructure and find even one berth that remains unused for a few number of days, and let's advertise it openly and create a process for sharing. There are cruise vessels. There is, for example, Ponant, Charcot. There's tourist boats where they say, okay, let's have at least some science program. Let's open it up and fund scientists to come on our ships and do their thing. There are sailing boats. Today was the end of the big race with Team Alicia, Boris Herrmann. He made the difference with his sailing boat, offering it for sensors, even though it costs them some velocities. There are sailing boats that always measure and help scientists analyze the data and more. So it would be not true to say the world is closing down for scientists. It is actually opening. And because I see Nalan in front of me, Norway organizes with Svalbard an international hub for Arctic science, with so many countries being present and sharing and teaching each other. It's actually, there are more good examples, I find, than the very sad, bad examples that we have today.
I have exactly the same experience with the digital twin of the ocean. The great thing about digital twins is that it puts the light on the upstream, that is the data system you have, space and water, and it's absolutely obvious that constructing the bits and pieces of a digital twin coming from different bits of science necessitates a sharing of the data. And the digital world is a world where sharing in a way is much more necessary, obvious to everybody. And I have exactly the same experience as Antje in the stream we are moving forward to, and we will probably present mid-June in Brussels the first prototype of what this European digital twin will be, which of course would make no sense without a world digital twin. And sharing data is, I mean, there's a higher level in the digital twin, in the digital world, than there is in the previous one.
You want to comment on this, Frederik? No. Okay, let's turn it to the audience and see if there are some questions there. Yes, Rasmus.
Yes, Rasmus Paulsen from the Arctic University of Norway. We have had throughout the day this question about scientific cooperation and the autocratic nature of Russian society and how it influences science. And I'm somewhat puzzled by some of these arguments. In social sciences and humanities, my own field, non-free societies, it's hugely detrimental to quality in social sciences and humanities. But if closed societies do not politicize their natural sciences and technologies, it seems much less detrimental to the quality of their natural science and technology. I think the horror example is Lysenko in Soviet genetics. So, and I'm thinking about, I think the European Space Agency, NASA, must still be collaborating with Roscosmos about sending astronauts to the International Space Station. So there, I think that collaboration is still going on. So there we have very advanced natural science technology cooperation between the United States, Europe, Russia, and probably also Japan. So I am quite unconvinced by this self-exclusion argument. I basically think that we made the decision in the West to cut these academic ties. And I hope there was a clear aim and a well thought out line of thinking that by cutting these academic ties, we seek to obtain exactly this and this goal. And then the question is, did we obtain that goal by choosing that line of action? Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if you look into the processes, I can only tell it from the German response. So we had always very strong ties to the Russian Academy of Sciences, and as it was said during Mosaic, it was everyone was on board. Russian scientists, Chinese scientists. Is not, you could say, it's not a problem of the scientists. Of course, they are the same, and I have worked all my life since I'm 20 years old. I have almost a family of Russian scientists with whom I do deep sea biology studies. They are still the same people, right? But what has happened directly when the war started, and we were together in Monaco, Olivier Poivre and I, the next day the Russian Academy of Sciences posted a letter. The letter was taken down, and the ones that signed up against the war, against the aggression on Ukraine, they were visited by police the same afternoon. And they were soon after replaced. You can look at the presidents of universities who were replaced. You know all of the story if you look inside. And then afterwards, a few days later, letters were published saying that the universities of Russia support the...
well, I don't think that's I don't think that's what the question leads to. The question was about, probably if I interpreted correctly, that the strong reaction came from the side of the West. They were the one who cut off the ties. You can see the Russian reaction as a reaction to cutting off the ties. What would have happened if the ties would not have been cut off? I think that's the question.
Yeah, but it doesn't work. I mean, if you work at the level of a university and your university counterpart explains to you in a letter, we have to kill the gay Nazis in Ukraine, and believe me, these conversations took place. Then you cannot cooperate at the level of the university. Germany has taken a very clear stand to say the individual peer-to-peer collaboration, as long as it's possible, the co-publication of data works, and it has worked so far. But polar science means investment on a large scale. It means planning expeditions together. It means making big plans at the level of universities, and there it doesn't work if you cannot agree on a set of values. And that is our problem. We have a set of values where we are confronted that we cannot, as a university director or institutional director, cooperate with. So we had a very clear assessment, and I'm very grateful to our ministry in Germany to have found the right language for exactly that. Peer-to-peer, there is no problem, but institutions have to agree on certain values in which we cooperate. And most countries have followed and used that example.
Can I follow that up with a difficult question?
Even more difficult. Wow.
If the assumption is shared values, how do you deal with cooperation with China on polar science?
Well, the scientists are independent.
Yes.
And we looked exactly, I was working together with a number, or we are working together with a number of universities. We have conflicts when it is about resources, that is clear. And, you can talk to a university, and that is so clear about climate sciences, about what is the next research that has to be undertaken, that there is no problem. There is no university director who says anything about how we have to politicize science, but that is not the case in Russia. It's very different situations.
So you would have no problem with increasing the cooperation with China?
We have a very high cooperation with China.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's my question.
Then you need some sort of government ethical committee to decide with whom you can work. Then.
No, this is not the government. We are in an agreement together, and many scientists worry about this. And of course, we don't have one opinion with this. We all have to look into this again and again. The history teaches us, I always work with the Science Historian Institute, it's excellent, and they have looked into the matter, and history tells us if we do not agree with certain values on the long run, it will cost us tremendous amounts, even of money. You can say that. You can ask our industry, they say the same. But let's not confuse the two things. If I cannot have a dialogue, or have to have a dialogue where it's about science, and my neighbor talks to me and try to teach me what the reason for a war is that I don't agree to, I cannot continue with this conversation. I think that is very obvious.
I'm with you, Antje.
Well,
okay,
sorry to say.
I think that's why we sit this way, huh?
Yeah, to some extent, we are lucky that time is out.
No.
But I think this panel has illustrated, first of all, as we wanted to illustrate, the importance of polar science cooperation. And it's also illustrated the need for continued dialogue. This is a new challenge that we have not dealt with in recent years. If this forum had taken place in June of 2020, as was initially planned, nobody would have had this kind of discussion at the time. So that is why we have brought this to the main stage here. And that's why we are also discussing this at some other sessions, and why we will have the polar dialogue continue at the Arctic Circle Assembly in October. And it's also the reason why the panel following this one is on the scientific role of the observer states in the Arctic Council. Not only the European observer states, but also the Asian observer states. So let me thank the three of you for very open and frank discussion and having raised some of these crucial issues, even if there is some debate about the answer to these questions. And Henry, I now hand it over to you to take over and lead the final panel on the scientific contribution of the observer states in the Arctic Council. Thank you.
Thank you.